So everybody, we all know the usual routine. This is not an official ACLU event. This is simply a gathering of friends, and we're delighted that Bob Pendleton is speaking to us from Northern California. The floor is yours, Bob.
Very good. Well, I'm happy to be back, and my wife is tagging along. She's been on the list for a while, but she's interested in what I have to say as well. And I'm going to share the screen and get the first slide up here. Not that one. There it is. There. All right. Does everybody see that okay?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Now I got to get one more on this side, and I'm ready to go. So measures of effectiveness and systemic racism are two halves of this talk. And measures of effectiveness are important to consider because of the fact that they apply quantitative thinking to what are essentially a lot of political decision making. And that's important because if you want to achieve political change, you need to understand how the measures of effectiveness work. And I'll explain that and show you how often they've led us astray and a few times where they can work fine. And then systemic racism, which I know Sharon and I, but I think a bunch of others understand, is probably the most serious political problem facing the country today. In fact, it is the political problem facing the country today. And gee, that's an important thing to emphasize. And I'm not going to do it great justice, but I am going to say that the clue will be combining these two things together. Measures of effectiveness are abbreviated MOE. And when I got my first job with the Navy, getting a little echo. Okay. I heard MOE. I don't know what's happened. Is everybody hearing the echo as well?
No, you're coming across very clear.
It's clear.
And I'll live with it. Everybody talked about MOE in the Navy all the time, and I was an analyst working for them, and so I had to learn what it meant. And the first example I'm going to give has to do with bombing, and it has to do with World War II. In World War II, we entered the war after Pearl Harbor, and we were getting the stuff beat out of us in the Pacific. And so that was very bad, but we had made political agreements, starting with Lend-Lease to support England and to support defeating Germany in Europe. And we had to invade Europe to do that. We knew that, but that was going to take years to prepare for. And in the meantime, how are you going to handle the political issues of keeping the public in the US, which was basically against the war and just kind of dragged along by politicians, and keep their interest high? And it turned out that bombing provided a way of claiming success. And we'll talk about how that happened. The number of bombs dropped, now pay attention to what that is, was used as a measure of effectiveness. So the bombers went out in a mission and they tried to go as deep into Germany as they could. And in those days, the range of the aircraft was not very high. And so they planned out the mission so that the bombers, which were heavy and burned more gas on the way out, would drop all their bombs so they would be lighter, and literally just barely made it back to their airfields or to in time. And so the number of bombs dropped had to be high, and it was used as an MOE. But the first thing you might notice about that is that it didn't matter whether they hit the target. And in fact, usually they didn't hit the target. And it didn't matter if they even had a target, because often they didn't have a target, and the bomb crews just dropped the bombs. And it didn't matter whether the target was military or civilian. And they did not have the kinds of intelligence assets in place to know whether or not they actually did any military damage. And they also felt and constantly said, these people who used number of bomb drops as an MOE, that it was going to destroy the morale of the enemy. Even at the same time as the Battle of Britain had taught us that the English morale was not at all destroyed by bombing. They endured a terrible bombing. And so we actually knew that heavy bombing was not enough to destroy morale or change people's political views. And what we were doing was trading a slight reduction in US military casualties, because many less people were lost in the air war than would be lost if we went in prematurely on the ground, in return for huge increases in civilian casualties, both friends and foes, because the bombing was so inaccurate. We needed troops on the ground to occupy Italy and Germany, but we weren't ready to do it. And now we come to the real hook here. What did bombing do politically? The answer is it led us to create an Air Force. The Air Force at that time in World War II was part of the Army, and a number of powerful generals in the Air Force in Bomber Command wanted to see the Air Force be created in 1948, which it was. And you might say that all of this activity and the use of this MOE was all focused on that one thing. But another military thing, more in the time that Vinny was talking, is when we use body count as an MOE. We all know now that there was no way to win in Vietnam, but politically, the US couldn't tolerate losing. And so we had to, and we did, create an MOE that enabled us to say for years and years and years and years and years that we were winning when we were actually losing. And that MOE was body count. It was reported daily by commanders, and then reported in the newspapers in the United States throughout the war. It was supposedly a body count of enemy combatants. But why would the Viet Cong capitulate? The more we tore up the Vietnamese villages, the more we drove the residents to support the Viet Cong. The body count was not even accurately reported. It was inflated by military commanders to prove progress towards victory. Now here you see the way in these examples that the MOE is driving what people are doing. The Cali murder trial served to exacerbate the partisan divide. And that's a very interesting thing to understand, is the fact that at that time, Cali had his defenders, plenty of them. It wasn't the people who are listening to this talk. We didn't have a viable military objective in Vietnam. And this is frequently true in cases of US interventions in support of regime change. So this is throughout the entire Cold War. All right, another one. Cops and prosecutors get their living from the criminalization juggernaut. I talked about that before. The real goal ought to be eliminating crime. But arresting criminals is a way to keep cops and prosecutors working. And if crime were eliminated, the cops and prosecutors would be out of a job. So the law enforcement juggernaut is focused on those deemed guilty. If crime were eliminated, cops would be out of work. So keep arresting and charging people, and use that as we're doing a great job. And keep using that to expand the power of police forces. I see it up here in a battle in Oakland, California, where the murders have increased, and they're trying, one group of people are trying to cut the founding of the police, and another is trying to raise it. Nor has fully compensating victims been our goal. The result of this is large and powerful law enforcement agencies. So we take.
Let's see. I did the dishes. What? I did the dishes.
All right. So let's go on. And throwing money at a problem is an American custom. And dollars spent is an MOE. A politician can always answer and say, we spent so much money on this or that problem. And so whether or not the problem is solved, the amount of money spent is an indication of, if they spend billions of dollars, then they did more to solve the problem than if they only spent millions of dollars. And that's just the simplistic way that thinking is going about dollars spent and getting somewhere. The measures of effectiveness get into a huge fight in the educational arena as well. The administrators count money spent as doing their job well, and the teachers union count teachers on the job, and therefore they seek low class sizes. But in both cases, they're using the measures of effectiveness to drive their politics. Okay, so you must have a numerical measure of progress, and the examples I've shown that show that they can be terribly inappropriate and get you in trouble. So when we think about things we're trying to achieve with ACLU, we need to think about, what's our measures of effectiveness? What are we doing about this? And we need to remember that there are some things that are perfectly easy to measure. For example, infant mortality. We can count those. They're very well recorded. All our states in the United States count the number of children. They record it. Death statistics are very important for lots of reasons. And we count that. And so we can look at the data and say that we really do not have a good health program in the United States. We do not have good public health. And the infant mortality statistics by themselves are enough to prove that's the case on that. Literacy is another thing. It's pretty easy to measure. Not how literate people are, that you can argue about, but the very fact of just being able to read is something that we can tell who can read, who cannot. The ones who can't read, just give them a book and you'll find that out. We can count our homeless. So there are some things that are easy to count and that are appropriate. The large number of homelessness is telling us we have a huge problem, but we haven't found a way to solve that. Okay, so that's all an introduction of the idea of measures of effectiveness, and they need to be the right ones. And then let's try to look at the next part of the talk. And it's a brief, I have only a few slides in front of me today. So I'm hoping that the conversation that will come, and we have enough people to have a good conversation, will get us further. Systemic racism is, I believe, the fundamental problem facing the US, and let's define it. But let me define it by yeah, okay. How many of you have been to Benton Harbor, Michigan, or know about it? I don't see hands going up. It was in my teenage mind because there was an outfit there called Heathkit. And how many of you have heard of Heathkits? Well, Benny has.
I remember Heathkit.
Yeah, right. And it was the world. Exactly. It was the World Headquarters. It was an electronic kit company. And they would put together the resistors and capacitors and frames and ship them out to you, and you had your soldering iron, and even kids could handle that soldering iron, and they could make electronic components for music systems. And of course, kids love music systems. And they had mail order electronic kits for tuners and receivers and transmitters, preamps, amplifiers. So Benton Harbor was a name in my mind. It was hi-fi and then stereo. I started with Heath kits when they were monaural. And then Elsa and I were traveling, and we thought after we retired. And one of the places we just happened to visit was Benton Harbor, Michigan. And there's another city that's right next door to Benton Harbor called St. Joseph, not St. Joseph, Missouri, but St. Joseph, Michigan. And they're called sister cities. And you need to watch out for that, because that's terribly misleading. Benton Harbor and St. Joseph are stunning examples of institutional racism. Benton Harbor is a Black ghetto. St. Joseph has been called the Hamptons for Chicago. Wealthy Chicagoans have their weekend places in St. Joseph, Michigan, on the shores of Lake Michigan. And so one of these sister cities has a high crime rate. You're not surprised to hear that, because the police are making sure of that. And the other is whites only. What happened to really key that thing and get it started was that Heathkit went out of business. It was a slow process, but they did, and factory electronics became cheaper than the kits. And when they went out of business, a lot of people lost jobs. Benton Harbor lost jobs. And instead of providing some economic rebirth, white flight took place. The county government buildings were moved from Benton Harbor to Joseph. The schools in St. Joseph were favored. And there were 6 days of rioting in 1966. That was during the 60s. That was a lot of days of rioting. It was in all the national news at that time. Police brutality and race riots. So this city and its sister city is what jumps to my mind when I think of systemic racism. Because let's look at some definitions. Systemic simply means it's tied to the system, it's institutional, or it's structural. In other words, just living life in the United States the way we normally do leads us to have this racism. David Wellman, in Portraits of White Racism, this is an older book, System of Advantage Based on Race. Lending practices favor whites over blacks. Housing restrictions favor whites over blacks. Schools favor whites over blacks. Job opportunities and promotions. And they're all embedded in laws. Some people feel it has to be in law, but I think the important thing is that it's embedded in society. At the same time that everybody in Benton Harbor is being erased and criminalized, the people the criminals in St. Joseph are not. They are either not arrested or they are not charged. And one of the things about this is that the systemic racists can pretend to be nice. They are not nice, but they are taking care of themselves. I mean, what are they going to do? The house price down? They can't stay there. They have to go. They have to take care of their children. The American way is to raise your children as well as you can. And so that's a very important thing to understand. The white people of privilege want to continue living with that privilege. And that's what gives way to systemic racism. When I started studying genealogy, I found some colonial relatives. And I was very interested in discovering that the American dream began before there was an America. The colonials went to a particular town and they organized together and said, all right, this is our town. They somehow managed to get the property from the Native Americans. And then the first thing they did was allocate property to each one of the founders of the town. And so for free. So all of a sudden, anybody who was a founder of a town didn't have to pay money. And they got that real estate, and that was part of the American dream. After a few years, it was worth a lot of money. They sold the real estate, they took their money and went to the next town, which was just starting up, and they got more real estate allocated to them. And they bought real estate, and they kept building up property in the form of real estate, all of which belonged to the Native Americans, but nevertheless, it was now being usurped by the colonists. And that pattern of colonial living has created the social structure that we have today. Building and owning a house is the American dream. Making money in real estate, and it's that money in real estate that leads us to a bunch of these same problems, because you've got to protect your real estate, which means you've got to keep all the undesirable people out of your towns and communities so that your property will be worthwhile. And you're being a racist and covering it up by saying, well, what am I going to do? I have to do this. And I'm really nice to blacks. I mean, so a lot of racism is happening, but it's happening in private. It's not, this is the systemic racism, and this is practiced by the huge majority of Americans today, because the huge majority of Americans today are pursuing that great American dream. And to do that, they end up taking and doing racist things and saying, well, what can I do? There's a racist covenant here and I can't break it, and so forth. This is by far the most insidious and powerful form of racism. This is it, because it's happening day by day, person by person, throughout the country. How can we introduce measurements into this? If racism relates to beliefs, and the beliefs are private beliefs, and they're not spoken publicly, nevertheless, they're still racist. How do you measure these unspoken beliefs? Well, one way I had early on in life was looking at interracial marriages. We have one of them right here in my panelists, in our participants list today. And that always proved to me something good, but because it said, one of the things I heard, my father's a terrible racist, and he let his racism be heard by me, and I kept my mouth shut because I was grateful for his money. But the old thing was, would you want your daughter to marry him? It was always it. So the idea that the black man would come and somehow pollute your family by marrying your daughter, that was the height of what people were frightened of, and basis of racism. But there's to me, looking at Benton Harbor and St. Joseph and saying, well, look at the inequities between these two sister cities. That tells us that we've got structural racism, that we've got systemic racism here. At least it tells me that. But that assertion is contested politically on the grounds that when you have inequities, that merely means that those that are less fortunate are not sufficiently skilled or talented to earn greater fortune. In other words, they brought it upon themselves, that kind of thinking. And we're still having that. We have that today. That's what's happening, and it's what's driving our country apart. Systemic racism underlies the partisan divide. It underlies it. So I'm throwing this open. That's all 12 slides. And I really want to get some discussion going. Are there other quantitative tools besides the one I gave you? I'll go back here. Interracial marriages that that you could use as a measure of progress. Maybe. To me, most of the things I'm seeing are bad news. They're bad news. All the inequities, the fact that blacks, on almost any quantitative measure you come up with of having a good life, you find that blacks and other minority groups, but blacks in particular, aren't doing as well. To me, that's proof and that's a measure. But as long as you've got this thing sitting around here where people say, oh, no, that's not a measure of that just means that they're not good people. And so this is tough. This is tough. What tools can we do, and how do we measure progress in defeating racism? And I'll end the briefing, and I think I will go to, no, I want to go to no, stop sharing. How do I do that? Come on, Bob.
Down at the bottom, screen share tab, stop share.
Oh, there it is. I got it. There it is. I got it.
So Bob, I have a question.
Good morning, Carolina. Yeah, Warren.
Good morning. It's so nice to see you all. Miss Bob and Elsa very much. And while I have the floor, let me toss this idea out. It's not really an idea, it's an observation. In all of the months that we've had this last year, people and police departments have been reviewing what public safety means. And I'm hearing a lot, instead of measuring arrests and convictions, let's find ways to measure trust between people and police. I think that's a tall order. I haven't really seen what that might look like, but I like the idea.
Yes, I think that's true. And it's as I said before, some of these things are kind of intangible. It's like, how do you know whether a person says, I haven't had a racist thought? Are they telling you the truth, or are they simply saying it because it's the proper thing to say? Warren.
Yes, I have a question, Bob. This information on measure of effectiveness in war and about bombing, and it's really damaging to the U.S. reputation. Isn't it classified information? How did you find this out?
Well, it's not classified. I have a story about classified information since you brought that out. How many of you remember Y2K? Okay, Y2K was the year 2000. And the early computer programmers had programmed all their computers with 2 digits for the year. Instead of saying 1972, they said 72, or 1988, they said 88. And so when the year 2000 came up, they were going to have to go to 4-digit numbers to separate the 2 centuries. They went to the 2 digits because computer space was very much at a premium. But they understood that a lot of programs existing on a lot of early computers might be wrong. And in particular, a lot of those computers were military computers. And so the military services were directed to assess the problem and go out and do this. And there was another guy who was in a group that I worked with when I was working for the Navy, and he got assigned to this job. And there was direction that came down from headquarters of the Navy saying this should be classified confidential. And the thing is that, and it was classified, so they had individuals going out into the field and assessing the computers that were at risk. And there were, in fact, quite a lot of computers that were deemed to be at risk at this time. And my friend said, this is not the correct classification. This involves the national security of the United States. And because knowing in aggregate everything that can happen to all of these shows a total national weakness and risk in the year 2000. And indeed, there were a lot of problems that had to be fixed in that year. But he said, I thought the classification should be higher. I thought it should be top secret, which is indeed what the definition of the classification implies. And eventually he was treated so badly that he retired early, took early retirement, got out of the Navy. So Warren, you're right. You're right. But the classification authorities don't see things that same way. The statements that I gave about both the bombing and the formation of the Air Force and the conditions in Vietnam, I would say, are opinions. You can decide how much you rely on them. I think that a lot of the information about the Vietnamese War and a lot of information about the Second World War came out after the fact. At the time, things seemed very different. And as you know, anytime a war is going on, a great deal of attention is spent on propaganda. And that kind of led to these things. I mean, the newspapers and the media go along with that propaganda. Does that respond to your question?
Yes. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Can I, do we have a
Uni.
stack or something?
Sharon is the only one with her hand up, and I'm after her.
I have my hand up too.
Oh, I didn't see Vinny's. Okay.
I kept my
Ladies first,
And
please.
Okay, so you remember I'm still in a meeting, so I put my picture up in the other meeting, so they can't see me talking. So you were asked, oh, Bob, thank you so much for this presentation. It really brings tears for me. It does, because you and I are really on the same page about this problem with racism and the division of labor in the United States is a serious issue that could in fact lead to our nation being completely dysfunctional. And we saw what happened in January 6th. As a result of January 6th, we know how much white supremacists, white nationalist organizations have infused themselves in our military, in our police departments. These people are armed and they're very dangerous. And I think that your presentation laying out the many ways in which racism is a fiber that runs throughout the fabric of this nation. So one measure is sort of funny. Chris Rock, the stand-up comedian, Black stand-up comedian, if you guys don't know who he is, he always says that we'll know we're making progress in this nation when we have Black people let go for crimes that they've committed. They don't get arrested. They don't, when we can be as criminally minded as rich white people, then we know we're getting somewhere. But I'd also offer up that, you know, we tend to look at the tip of the iceberg, the most extreme cases, the, you know, police brutality and so on. But it's the other areas of life that have its greatest impact on the Black community, and to a lesser extent, but certainly other people of color. And that is the day-to-day, the employment issues, the housing issues, the healthcare. Most healthcare information, statistics, studies that are done on what is normal blood pressure, or they're done mostly on white people. And so Black people, for example, for a long time, it wasn't known about the impact of our vitamin D deficiency. Because we have extra melanin in our skin is, we don't get the same benefits from being in the sun. We get a benefit because we're protected, but we don't get the benefit of the vitamin D benefit. And so, like, I take extra vitamin D. Well, one of the bad side effects of having a vitamin D deficiency is cancer, COVID. They're looking at COVID-19, but these things are generally not researched. And Black people are blamed for their poor eating habits or their whatever, when there's so much that has to do with weathering, that has to do with not studying Black people. Yeah, my weathering, you guys remember a couple of years ago when I threw out that top tooth thing, threw it over but because I'm always on angst. And if my son calls me at an abnormal time when I think he should be teaching in a class, and I get a phone call from my son, I swear, every time that has ever happened, my heart just jumps out of my chest. Something is wrong, and it ain't gonna be a good thing. These are the calls we are constantly sitting on edge with. So anyway, I'm gonna go back to my meeting. I would be here with all of you, and I thank you so much, Bob, for presenting this. And I think that we need to explore this further in terms of the way it impacts the entire nation. Thank you.
So I have Uni next, unless Bob wants to respond to that.
Just that I agree completely. And it was what I was trying to say when I said, I just looking at the inequities, given my understanding of the world, proves the existence of structural racism, systemic racism. Uni.
Yes, thank you very much. And Bob, I was not aware that you were in Northern California, but welcome. And please continue to check on us every weekend. I am so glad, Mrs. Pendleton as well. You know, it is so good to see you. I want to say that what you referred to, you know, the interracial marriages, I think it will be the ultimate to solve a little bit of the problems. When you mentioned we have a couple here, I was thinking, wow, how does he know that I'm intermarried? I am married, interracial, and then I go, oh, never mind, it's not me. I have 5 sisters, and everyone married a different race. Nobody elected to marry a Latino. We were kind of like shocked by the way of my father. My father was not a good man, so we wanted to stay away from anybody looking like him to marry, because we thought, you know, we saw what my mother went through with him. So anyway, and then my children also did not marry a Latino and did not marry an Indian. You know, my husband is Indian, from India. And my 3 children did not marry a Latino nor an Indian. Probably they thought that we brought some baggage with us, so we're gonna stay away from them. So it is interesting, but that is how I feel the country is going to heal, by having, like, my two sisters married a Black man. So one kid looks African American and one child looks Latino. So, and they both love each other so much, you know. So that love and that compassion and that caring is going to carry on with us. And I you know, really feel blessed to have a different race involved in my world. Sharon was talking about January 6th. What happened in January 6th? It didn't exist. It was an ordinary visit of Americans staying within the velvet ropes of the Capitol building. That's what we are hearing about on the TV from US representatives. So what is your problem? So that's it.
So Vinny was
Thank
next,
you.
and you'd have to, you're muted, Vince. You're muted, Vinny.
I was going to say, Dick, you go next, age before beauty.
Okay, so I was going to extrapolate on what Sharon had to say about, it's well known that African Americans suffer health consequences. They have a shorter lifespan as a group. They're more subject to diabetes and high blood pressure and so forth. And Sharon mentioned the word weathering. As a white person somewhat embedded in a Black family, I really get to see on a day in, day out basis how weathering works. You know, all of us are aware of the headlines of Trayvon Martin being murdered, of George Floyd being murdered. But up close and personal, you see how the phone call, the worry about her son driving to the school where he's taught for many years in South LA, and her concern that he might get pulled over by gangs or the police, and jobs denied, and promotions denied. But I want to extrapolate that to it. I think it should puzzle us is why we don't have universal health care when Liechtenstein can figure out how to have it. And you know, the lack of universal health care, certainly it impacts African Americans who are less wealthy, but it impacts white people too. And yet poorer whites are recruited to oppose universal health care. Why? Because they're sold the line that they shouldn't be paying for health care for people who look like my wife. And I think you can see that in many policies, but that's kind of a measure of effectiveness, is why are we behind San Marino with health care?
Yeah.
Vinny, you're up, and then Jim. Then Carolina, and then Jim.
3 quick points here. In regarding your measure of effectiveness, I can't remember where I read it, but it really struck me because Robert McNamara did extensive studies on the strategic bombing during World War II. And every time they did it, they were doing it in reverse. They were not taking the data to determine what was best. They were looking for an explanation for a solution they wanted. Measures of effectiveness are only as effective as the way they are presented. Which brings me to the next point, and that is the idea of interracial marriage as a measure of effectiveness of reducing racism. I wrote an article several years ago that the folks at the LA Progressive were good enough to publish, called Confessions of a Lifelong Racist. I consider myself a racist because I was born to be a racist, because I grew up in all white communities. I went to all white schools. I went to all white churches, even in the 60s, up until I went to high school. And that inculcates in the individual a sense of superiority and
let me shut you
a
up.
question of the otherness of anybody that doesn't look, sound, or act like you. And in this day and age, Jesus Christ, 66 years after Brown versus Board of Education, the notion that you would hear in the news an all-Black school in downtown Los Angeles, I find anathema today, because although racism and segregation aren't the law of the land they were under Jim Crow, they continue in their de facto presence until people of different races, ethnicities, religions live and work together and get to know one another and recognize their common humanity. We're just rearranging deck chairs in the Titanic if we live in our siloed lives. Take it away, Carolina.
Carolina was next, and then Jim.
I just finished a book called Until We Reckon by Danielle Sered. Raise your hand if you've read this book. And if not, please put it on your list. It talks about how the US began as a country in violence. And it was mentioned by Bob that we took land from Native Americans, and you know the history: slavery, wars, Jim Crow, redlining. And her point was, until we acknowledge that, we can't undo it. So there is this big lie, right? That we are a country of peace. We are a country that cares for each other. Until we are able to tell the truth, then there can't be healing. I thought that was very important. And I would also like to point out something that Sharon said, the effects of constant low-level trauma. Okay, it's not like major traumatic events, but it's constant. Think about a kid, who grows up 0 to 3, 0 to 7 with constant low-level trauma. They're hyper-vigilant, and it affects their health. It affects their decision-making. So this is a huge issue. It's not just about police reform. Thank you for
shut this off if you're going to talk.
It's Jim's turn.
Yes. One of the things that struck me in Bob's really, really wonderful presentation is he said intermarriage between the races is a measure of systemic racism. And it struck me that I have never gone out with a Black woman or Black girl or whatever, because you go out with and you marry the people that you associate with. And I never associated. My neighborhood was completely all white. My school was all white, and so that's why. And if you think about it, most of this is because our neighborhoods are segregated, and so you don't associate with somebody if you don't live near them, especially when you're older teenager or younger 20s, where you meet people that you're going to marry. And I think now maybe you might meet somebody where you work, because people kind of travel, although even that is, in a lot of ways, that's because of where you live. You don't want to travel, 40 miles to work. So that's all I have to say.
Bob, you can jump in anytime. I see Elsa has her hand up and she's muted still.
You have to unmute, Elsa.
I did just now. I think you all probably know.
You lost it again.
Oh, I'm sorry. I screwed up. You need to unmute. There you go.
There I am. You know that we lived in Pasadena before we moved north. And I didn't know until we got to Pasadena that they had been the site of a case which went to the Supreme Court about desegregation of schools. And it wasn't that long ago. It was in 1970, I believe. And it had to do with the fact that the elementary schools were scattered through the city, but they were not equally mixed as far as races were concerned. And so there was a lot of work done at the time on not necessarily fixing the schools, but fixing transportation so that they could move the small children from one school to another by bus, or by, when they decided it was too expensive to use school buses, they used public transportation. And it eventually wound itself through the courts, as I understand it, and they reached a settlement, which has not been a terrifically big success. And as we were leaving Pasadena, I was hearing noises that it may be happening again, and you all might want to keep your eyes and your ears tuned in that direction, because the neighborhoods in the city are still racially imbalanced as far as housing is concerned. And the city is struggling with all kinds of financial problems. So what they're trying to do is change the, encourage people to come back into the public school system, which is suffering. It's going to be a very, very fascinating struggle to watch, and it'll take another 10 years.
I see Paul having his hand up. Paul? You're muted.
Yeah, like Vinny and Jim, I grew up in a almost all white environment until I went off to Berkeley, and it was there that I was exposed to the world. And so one of the problems I see now is that, well, especially in Los Angeles, where, a lot of these colleges and universities are commuter schools, they drive there, take their class, and then they go home. And then now they're going more and more towards classes online, where the students don't really interact and learn more about different people and coming from different cultures and backgrounds. So, I in that sense, I see us moving backwards.
So I have this little thought to ping off of what Jim said. The only way really that the races in America are going to learn to live together is by living together. Yeah. I mean, the effort to desegregate the schools in the 50s and 60s, Brown v. Board of Education, ultimately failed. Schools are now more segregated than they were back then. And Martin Luther King famously said that the most segregated time in America is during church services. But I guess my point is, a lot of times we look to Washington to solve our problems, or Sacramento, or City Hall. But really on this issue, it's going to depend on us, on people, and the choices we make. I mean, if we go into our workplace and I go to the coffee pot and everybody's a standard issue white guy like me, well, that's both a problem and an opportunity. I can agitate at my company to be more inclusive. It's the choices I make of who I choose to associate with. I will say that I like the other fellows here. I grew up in the farthest out suburbs of Minneapolis that were all white. Fortunately, Cookie Vargas lived down at the end of the block. Go for it.
Oh, okay. So I've been trying to listen to both meetings, so excuse me if I missed some of what, or if I repeat something that's already been said. But I was listening to Jim Nicella's characterization of the communities where he was raised and how that led to who he married and dated and so on. And that's exactly what institutional racism is. In many ways, it's about an unconscious, not a decision to be a racist, not even an awareness of racism. Right. It is perpetuating systems of segregation but it's not state enforced. Sometimes it is state enforced because we had redlining for a very long time. But if you look at Brown v. Board of Education, which was a Supreme Court decision that said there is no such thing as separate but equal. If you have separation, you will have discrimination, oppression, and not an equitable sharing of resources. So we now have socially sanctioned segregation, meaning that people are not ashamed or embarrassed about living in communities that are racially one race, racially homogenous. They don't feel any shame about that. Now, there are many people that would be ashamed about belonging to a club that doesn't allow people of other races to join. You'd be ashamed. You wouldn't want to do that, but you actually are doing it in many ways and you're not even thinking about it. Black people do feel excluded. I feel strange when I walk into a room and I am the only one. And just imagine what that would feel like for you. This is where we live constantly. So I got to go back to my meeting. Sorry, guys.
Bob, and then Karen.
All right, I want to respond to some of that with some personal things. I probably had the most privileged youth of any of you. And when it came time, I'd gone to boys' schools. And when it came time to go to college, I had two requirements. That it have women and that it have Blacks. And I did that because early in my youth, my father had not allowed me to play with a young Bahamian boy who was living nearby, and especially because we were swimming together, we were swimming together. So we chose Oberlin, and I don't know if you know about that. A lot of Easterners here don't know much about Oberlin. It was the first college in America, more or less, to admit Blacks and give them college degrees, and the first college in America to admit women. It was in 1833. And it was a way station on the Underground Railroad, and it was founded by religious abolitionists who were not the greatest people in the world in terms of modern progressive thought, because they really thought Blacks were inferior. They just didn't like slavery. They hadn't come to the understanding. But when I got to Oberlin and spent 4 years there and was a very popular guy and so forth, guess what? I didn't make any Black friends. I didn't date any Black women. It is so hard. I just want to echo what everybody in this room has been saying. It is so doggone hard to really become open to the other race. So as Vinny says, I'm a white racist. All I have to do is say, I'm doing my best to try to understand it and acknowledge it. And I think that's important. Now, Karen.
Well, I'm kind of talking the same story. I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, and I was a nice Jewish girl, and I wasn't supposed to go out with anyone that wasn't Jewish. Yeah. And certainly I graduated in 66, so I think I was like 63 or 4 when they were starting to bus kids into our high school. And what I ended up doing was, I guess I started young, but I went and formed a group to meet the buses, to welcome the students, to make them feel comfortable. And when they came into our school, I, got out there and said, I really want to be friends and all this stuff. I was really attracted to the young Black men, but I was not even supposed to go out with a Christian, let alone a Black guy. And I decided, okay, I'm going to have to do this. But the internalized racism or whatever, I was afraid, as the virgin that I was in high school, that Black guys were so sexy that I wouldn't be able to resist. And I wouldn't be raped, but I would be so drawn into the sex that I would do it. And so my friends, kept telling me that's stupid, you could say no and all this stuff. And then, so I finally decided I would go out with a young Black man they would fix me up with. And the only one that they gave me a few to choose from, and the one I picked was in a wheelchair. So I thought I could protect myself. And so here I am, the liberal Jewish girl going out with the Christian Black boy. And I insisted that he be in a wheelchair, and I just never thought of that as being racist. But I'm finding a lot of things that I hadn't thought about.
I think Vinny was next, unless Bob wants to respond.
Well, that was very powerful, Karen. Thank you.
Well, Karen's statement made me think about something. And again, to prove just what a dingbat racist I am. Look, I hope this won't be inappropriate, but in my college years, in my late high school years, I was, to put it more than a little randy. I think I would have slept with a pumpkin if I could have. But the pumpkins weren't coming across. But there was a very dear friend of mine in high school. I liked her very much. And her name was Susie Wong. And they owned Wong's restaurant in Pasadena. And, we were pals and whatnot. And then years later, after I was married, I ran into her. And she told me, she said, Minnie, I always thought you were kind of cute. Why did you never ask me out? And of course, regret is something we all live with. And I think if I could go back in the Wayback Machine, all the women that I thought I could have slept with, I would have slept with them when I got a chance. The reason I mention this is that it wasn't even in my wheelhouse to consider that someone who looked different than me, that I even would think about that. And then in later years, obviously, I thought a great deal different. But it was that kind of embedded racism that I wasn't even cognizant of it happening in my brain. It just was something that was not even something I would consider. Shame on me for thinking that way. I mean, since she was a beautiful woman. My life might have been very, very different if I hadn't been such an idiot and I hadn't been such a racist. I think the idea that if we can come together and live together, that's the only solution. The more we're segregated, the more we're siloed, the more this is going to go on.
This meeting and this conversation that's taking place reminds me of an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting. And AA is one of the successful organizations that we have for dealing with people who tend towards alcoholism. And it's basically kind of it's also some religious meetings too, confession, but just recognizing how we get trapped and the social ways in which we get trapped is a very important thing. If we're going to combat systemic racism, then we have to begin with recognition. It's the first stage.
I think Rebecca was next, and then Carolina.
Hi, Bob. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks. It was a great presentation. I am just like reminded, I'm just so frustrated when I think about how our criminal justice system measures, itself by, how, many people are prosecuted, and, those kind of metrics are still used, and how does that change? And, it's just, I get frustrated that I'm not going to see that in my lifetime. I mean, I have hope that the younger generation will affect that change, by the defund effort now to really, put the emphasis on social program and raise awareness about, mental health and other, other issues. But, I got on the racism discussion. In my experience was, I was born in Compton. My parents lived in Compton, and but there was racism in my family, and I got to say that my parents were racist to a certain extent. I had an uncle who was beaten by a Black gang in Compton. And then after that, there was just so much fear about Black people. And my grandparents wanted the whole family to move out, out of Compton after that. And my parents didn't want me going to school in Compton. So, I mean, that drove them to move out of Compton. But where we moved was a Mexican barrio. And it was next door to Paramount. And so then their fear became that I was going to get jumped into a gang and get initiated into a gang. So, and I didn't feel like I experienced racism myself growing up, but there was definitely racism within my own family, because my father was Native American. He was very dark brown, and his father was Apache, and so they were the drunks. They were the drunks of the family. And since I looked like my father, my mom's side would tease me a lot, and my cousins and my aunts and uncles, about being so dark, like my dad, and being an Indian. So, and fast forward though, when I was in college, all of a sudden, and Dances with Wolves came out, all of a sudden, Indians were glamorous. And I remember walking down 2nd Street in Long Beach, and all these people turned around and looked at me. And I'm like, why are they looking at me? And and this guy I was with saying, oh, they could tell you're an Indian, you're Native American. Like, why are they looking at me? So yeah, it's definitely triggered a lot of memories for me, and stuff to think about. I live in Agoura Hills now, and I've lived here for 20 years. And I remember, when I realized that it was mostly Jewish community here, I had to I found myself trying to be careful about what I say. I didn't want to offend them as if I said anything. And I remember one time I used the word concentration camp, and a friend of mine was like, what do you mean that's a concentration camp? Why would you say? I said, like, I offended her by using that word out of the context of the Holocaust. And so I found myself being careful. On the other hand, too, I had another a friend of mine who's also Jewish, and he had admired my lawn, and he said, "Oh, you have a really nice lawn, and maybe I'll come park by your house one day, because I live by a park and there's a concert, they have concerts there." And then one day he said in front of a bunch of friends, I mean, he just caught me off guard. He said, "I'm just going to go park on Rebecca's lawn." And he was just being, and what triggered in me was, oh, he thinks I'm one of those Mexicans that, I parked my car on the lawn, and I had to watch myself, and I'm like, that's not what he meant. He was just like teasing and actually trying to give me a compliment. I have such a great lawn. And so anyway, it works both ways. But I've been fortunate. I've been lucky. I have a son who is light skinned, and I don't have the fears that Sharon expressed. But yeah, I could go on like that. But I just try to be more empathetic to the views of others, and try to recognize my own prejudice too, my own triggers. So thanks.
Carolina, I think you were next.
I think it was Karen who mentioned internalized racism. Let's focus a little bit on what that might mean for people of color. I grew up in an all-white community, so when those of you who spoke about never having thought to date a person of another race, I had the same thing. There were only white people around me. Maybe there was one other Filipino person in my graduating class. And I would often get, not just from my parents, but from friends and acquaintances, so why don't you date people of your own race? I would kind of giggle to look around. There aren't any. So that really made an impact on me. So it normalized for me that I would only date white people. And later on, when I learned about internalized racism, I realized that I was prejudiced against Filipino people. Of course, I loved my parents. They immigrated here and we had no relatives here. But so I think if you think about other communities, Latino communities, Black communities, children have internalized racism that impacts them. Even though they might be living in an all Black community, there are many studies that show young children prefer white dolls. You may know that classic study that continues to be the case. It really hasn't changed.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on something that Bob said about Alcoholics Anonymous. This past St. Patrick's Day, appropriately, I celebrated 40 years of sobriety in Alcoholics Anonymous, and attribute my relatively happy, productive life to that program. I also, for many years before I did this ACLU stuff, I helped run a halfway house down on the South Bay. And one of my proudest accomplishments really was that initially when we started it, it was right on the beach in the South Bay, and all the residents were white. And then we moved it inland to Torrance, and I took over and like joining the Peace Corps, I ran it for several years. I stepped away from a pretty decent job, and for $400 a month and all the food I could eat in a room in the back, I ran it, and I enforced it that it would be racially mixed with opposition. The local Alano Club, where the AA member, didn't like that I was bringing in Black guys from Compton and Carson, or Latinos from that neighborhood. But the point I wanted to make on that is like every institution we know, when I was active in AA, it had its problems with racism too. The Black residents in the house didn't frequently feel all that comfortable in mostly white meetings, especially if you're going to bare your soul, and you know, they struggled with that. And certainly Native Americans, I'm not sure why, but they really resisted having a white man's Bible shoved down their throat. So we actually had a meeting. There was a halfway house in Long Beach called Little House, where Native Americans went. And we wanted to know, well, how can we make this our place open? And I don't know that we solved that, but I mean, like in every aspect of life, AA has its issues with racism as well. That quieted everybody down.
In the article I wrote many years ago, I think what is paramount is for white people to recognize that the problem of racism is not a problem that Filipinos or Latinos or African Americans have. It is a white problem.
Yeah.
They suffer the effects. It is our disease. And until we resolve that issue, it's not the job of those others to resolve the issue of racism. It is a problem that must be resolved by white people affecting their own racism. In the same way that in a 12-step program, the very first step is to say, I am Vincent. Hello, my name's Vinny. I'm a racist. I think everybody has to do that. And I think that is the one thing that most white people find difficult. I'm not a racist, but and then the most racist thing will come out of their mouths, or just assume that it is somebody else's problem, or it has to be solved by somebody else. Really have to look in the mirror for the solution to this problem. And I think that is why it is so insurmountable at this point. Karen.
I was born in Brooklyn, and my grandmother was the first child of her family born in the United States. They came over the late 1800s. My grandmother, when we moved to Ohio, we would go back to New York, and I loved Brooklyn. I loved my grandmother. And as I grew, to elementary school and then high school, every time we come, my grandmother would say, "Are they moving to your neighborhood?" And first it was the Black people, and then it was the Puerto Ricans. And I could never figure out how this sweet little Jewish lady was so racist when her whole family had to immigrate. And it just, I never understood it. And I still don't. I mean, I still don't. When and maybe you can help me with this, because I live in Sierra Madre. There's a few people of color here, but not much. And I'm involved with a political organization, and we're trying to diversify and be open and be welcoming and all that. But I also don't sometimes feel like I don't want to be that white person that's so not racist and is so reaching out. I want to be able to go from my heart and really want to have a diverse community. And yet, as I talk, it sounds horrible. It's like, because it's like, well, how do we get more people of color in our group? Well, tell me. Anyone? You're all so smart.
Yeah,
Keep coming here, Karen.
I mean, the
That's
thing-
how, because this
I
is a
think-
diverse group.
I think the fact that it's in your head and you think about it, it's like if you have it's something that people do. If you're having an engagement in your house, well, give some thought to, is it going to be all people of my race and my religion, or am I going to try to make an effort to reach some other people? And I don't, I think it's not a light switch that you do it once and that's it, it's over. I mean, it's kind of a, it'll take time, but I do think that is the solution, that people of goodwill who want to have racial balance have to, at their workplace, at their church, at their parties in their home, they have to be giving it some thought, that the world is a better place if it looks like the world rather than just my little neighborhood.
Well, I would tell you myself, my experience has been that I always wanted to meet other people. I went to some classes of interethnic relations, and they told me, just look for some organizations where you can be on the board and there are no Latinos in there. Go there and be the first one. So I went on looking for, and I had a very good person that was introducing me to that organization that she belonged. She was a white lady, and took me over. So many of them welcomed me. So many of them did not. I could see that my mouth will open and everybody will go like, oh my God, there she goes. So I will quit those organizations. And they say, well, then you just giving up easy. I said, listen, you know what happened to Jesus Christ? He got ended up crucified because you wanted to change the world. I don't want to change the world. I want to be part of the world and see whoever wants to be part of me, you are welcome. I like when I mentioned I want to leave Pasadena, a group of ACLU, the first one to say, no, we need you, you're kind of funny, was Dick. I said like, yeah, I'm kind of funny and I should be there. I am welcome there. I feel like one person in the group. But on the other hand, I went to, like I was telling Bob some time back, I went to League of Women Voters, and every single thing that I would bring in that we should do was not even considered. Not it wasn't voted down. There was no second to my motions ever, with the exception of there was another person, an African American person there. She will always back me up, and would say, yeah, I second the motion. Okay, goes in, let's vote for it. That's it. 2 votes against everybody else. So, after 6 months of this, I said, I don't think they want me there. So, but of course, with every group of people, it changes. Bob was telling me just come back because right now we have a very good president, and I felt very good. So I should reconsider it. But so far, I tell you, when you want to invite somebody and listen to them, not tell them, listen to them. And make yourself feel what they feel, and if you do not understand it, go for it. Even with limited English language, you can understand them. It is not so, our group is very smart. You don't require to be a great philosopher or a great person to understand common people. And we do have a story.
So Uni, you are funny. I did encourage you to stay, but it was Chris that said you were funny and stay. Bob, you're up.
I'm funny for everybody, so that's not news for me.
Bob, you want to go?
Yes, I do. I want to shift gears because there was something I neglected to say in my remarks that I think is important. I've been trying to say that this systemic racism is the problem facing America today. And there was proof of that. This morning, I was reading a Lawyers, Guns, and Money post, and I recommend that particular blog if you have time to read blog posts. And they were talking about a study that had been made by Justice Department, I believe, as to who were the people who were involved on January 6th. And I had been one of the people who followed some early comments that said these are all right-wing, white nationalist groups and far-right groups, and that's the people who are out there doing that. Wrong. Wrong and doubly wrong. Who were they? Well, they were people who lived they were Republicans who lived in urban and suburban areas. They were established people in their communities. They had good jobs. They were executives. Some of them were, and they could see their white privileged life going away. They could see that happening, and they were rebellious, and they felt they had to keep Donald Trump in power because he stood for that value, and that's why they were there. They were from all over the country, and they were basically acting in many cases without direction. It was there, although there were leaders, but that was what was happening. These are the people who are related to those who are standing up in Congress and trying to whitewash what happened on January 6th. And I watched television on January 6th for hours and hours and hours, and they can never be able to whitewash that for me, never. But we need to understand that this is people we drive by on the street every day are the ones who are racist and absolutely they're white supremacists, but not part of any great organization. They're people who are trying to uphold the systemic racism because that's the life they grew up with, just as all of us did. Now we, for a pleasant reason here in this ACLU group, have thought better of it. And we reflect and we examine ourselves and we're given to introspection and we do those things. But That's not the people who were storming the Capitol building. And so we're terribly close to civil war, terribly close. This is a really deep societal problem.
So I would like to add to what Bob had to say there. I mean, that it's true. There is a counter-revolution going against the move toward multiculturalism in society. That's why people have guns in state capitals, because they don't like the idea that part of this country is making an effort to be more inclusive. But we also have to focus on the truth that the country is making more of an effort to be inclusive. I'm still touched by the fact that in this past year, there was something like 80,000 people, mostly white people, demonstrating in West Hollywood or Hollywood for the rights of Black trans people. And I think, you know, for the past 10 years, race relations and racial discriminations and the long list of police shootings and other violence has been forefront in the news. And I think people are paying attention to it in a way that maybe they weren't 10 years ago. But I think it'll be a battle. And we need to be on the right side in this battle, because there is this counter-revolution. There is this people who feel threatened. They don't want Black people or brown people in their neighborhoods, and they fear they're going to lose stuff. And indeed they probably will. They'll lose their unearned privilege. They'll learn their unearned advantage, and everybody will have a somewhat more even playing field.
That's right, Dick. Loss of privilege is what it's all about. Loss of privilege.
I think one of the problems is that people don't recognize their own privilege. And when they hear the word equality, they say they equate it with giving something to someone unearned and robbing it from someone who earned it, rather than recognizing the fact that, you know, like as a white male, I didn't hit a triple. I was kind of born on third base. And I think few people recognize the leg up that they have by virtue of the lack of melanin that they possess in their skin.
Enormous.
We see Tanya typing. We don't hear her voice much, so.
I'm here. This is a great discussion. This is a great discussion. I was thinking when Uni was mentioning the private schools in Pasadena, I went to one of those private high schools, and I remember our prom, we had wanted to have it at the Jonathan Club, and we had many Black students at our school. Well, we had a handful. We had enough that when we went to the Jonathan Club to meet with them and realized that they had some unique policy there regarding segregation, we protested and we canceled having it there. And but of course I was a brown girl at a mostly white school on scholarship, so I was in the thick of it. But this has been a wonderful, thank you so much, Bob. We miss you, and it's so wonderful to have you back with us for this discussion.
Good to be with you, Tanya.
Jim.
Oh, Jim, go. Jim, you're muted.
Two comments. I want to see Vinny eat a pumpkin. And the other thing is, I thought it was, Bob, it was so well researched. And thank you very much. That's it.
Well, any final thoughts? So next week, Sharon is going to interview me. That's if I'll let her. And then beyond that, we don't have any lined up. We hope to get some more lined up. Big thanks to Bob for flying down from the Bay Area. Any final thoughts? I see Paul has his hand up and he's muted.
A topic I was thinking about is it's a current idea people are talking about, which is reparations for African Americans, and some ideas behind it and how it would be implemented. If anybody can research that, I would be interested in hearing more.
Yeah, that's a great topic. That's a good topic.
Bob, thank you so very, very much. And I'm happy you're not dead.
Me too.
Yeah.
Me too.
I mean, to state the obvious.
Yeah.
You both look wonderful. I would never thought that Bob would have had COVID. Oh my goodness. Both of you, no? I think that. So both of you are fully vaccinated now?
Yep.
Yeah, we are. And the
Wonderful.
interesting thing, Uni, is that my case was quite severe, and Elsa's, she feels she hardly had it. It was nothing.
I'm
But she
curious.
tested positive.
Yeah.
Many of the people on this call have had their vaccine, both of them. And I'm curious if anybody's feeling any side effects from the CIA chip implants that we now possess to track us wherever we go.
I call MUFON, the UFO organization to check me out and see what is going on.
Yeah, I think there are easier ways for them to track us, commercially and everything with cell phones and what we buy. And
It sounds like you people are all reading the New Yorker.
So Sharon and I had different vaccines and had no reaction, but my 27-year-old daughter had quite a reaction to Pfizer. She was knocked out for a couple of days, she said. Which was
really?
Well, I was knocked out with Moderna for when 24 hours completely knocked out. I lost about 4 pounds, but I came out okay, after probably 2 days. After 2 days, I was okay, but that's okay, but just to consider what I would feel going to the hospital and staying there. 2 hours in bed, 2 days in bed are easy for me. I welcome it.
Has anybody followed the women who were involved with producing these vaccines? Kizzy, the one who did the vaccine from Moderna, and the woman professor up in Berkeley who worked on the mRNA.
Yeah, I was reading about them that they said not one, they're pretty much all foreigners that did work on this vaccine. Of course, some other people did have some, saying about it, but most of it work was done by foreigners. So I was happy to hear that. And they said, well, you're not going to read this one in LA Times or New York Times or anything. It was some other less known organizations that say these are the people that I don't even remember the name of the publication that did disclose who they were. So I'm really glad to hear that.
Well, as our resident socialist, I'd like to remind everyone that although the pharmaceutical companies, may they rot in hell forever, are planning on protecting their patents and making billions of dollars on this, the development of these vaccines occurred for the most part in our state and federally funded institutions of higher learning. We do the work, we pay for the work, they reap in the profits as the bodies stack up.
That's sad. That is very sad.
Always the case.
So we can end on a happy note.
Okay. Well, big thanks to Bob. See you all next week. And if any of you have ideas about presentations you want to make, you can contact me. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks,
Bye,
Dick.
all.
Thanks, Bob.
I